free drinks, and 2 amazing authors. So well worth it. I can't tell you how pleased I am to see them both after all these months, if not years, of Zoom screens.
Do I have the record for most Zoom hosting appearances?
You're pretty close.
I've got to be in the mix, right?
You were. Up until he decided to do nothing, Lee Child had the record. He kept appearing.
Yes.
And then one day he just decided he'd had enough. I think that might have been after we did the James Patterson President Clinton book launch. Which is the only time, if you're watching this, the only time I've ever seen James Patterson actually hardly say a word. Bill Clinton is a talker.
Well, there you have a champion. So.
You really do. But it was a lot of fun, and Lee really wanted to do it, but I'm not sure how many we did after that. But yes, Michael, you were. Michael was kind enough to, at the last second, come along, well, not quite at the last second, and do Dennis Lane last April. But you've done who all? Remind us.
Oh boy, Stuart Onan, Richard Chismar, Alistair Burke, James Lee Burke. Did something with Lee. I think I had Connolly in the mix, right?
Connolly.
Dean Koontz.
All right, Dean Koontz and
I know I'm leaving.
And Dennis.
And Dennis, yes, of
Right.
course. Yeah, the most recent one is the one I'm forgetting. So.
Right.
Good to see human faces again.
And we're thrilled to have you. Michael, for those of you who don't know it, has been with us from his very first book. So I feel as though I raised him from the puppy I left at home to his present. And he was only, 21 or 22 when that first book came out?
21, yeah.
That's what I thought.
First time I was here, I was 21.
Yep. So it's been a nice long curve over all these years, and I'm so pleased to have him back. Peter, one of my very favorite authors, is probably better known to you at the moment as Spencer Quinn, but that's not his real name, and so I will end up calling you Peter, even if I should be calling you Spencer.
Well, no, it's Peter on my driver's license.
It's okay.
Which I'll hold up, after.
Right.
You can scan it.
So many of you may have read the Chet and Bernie series, which is set somewhere in Arizona, right? Yep. But now Peter is doing an even braver new thing, entering into the elder sleuth realm with. Seriously, it's a thing. There's a whole bunch of them now.
Can I say that when I got the idea, I didn't know it was a thing?
You didn't?
No.
Okay.
I'm kind of in my own little. I'm out of most loops. Is the truth of the matter, for good or bad.
I got it. Well, for those of you who read Deanna Rayburn's Killers of a Certain Age, some of you may remember Dorothy Gilman's Mrs. Polifax, who was absolutely wonderful. There's Richard Osman and the Thursday Murder Club. There's a whole group. I think it's great that authors are empowering seniors, I being one, in order to, I'm not sure whether it's expanding the genre or broadening the audience. What do you think?
Well, I actually don't know, but I think it's not, from my point of view, it's not empowering the older. It's revealing the power that exists is the way that I was thinking of it in this. And that's one of the engines that I think, if Mrs. Plansky's Revenge actually does move, one of the engines driving it is that there's nothing showy about the internal power she has, but when required, it's there.
It is. It's an interesting mix of Mrs. Plansky trying to remember things and Mrs. Plansky leaping on a motorcycle and barreling over the Transylvania mountains. So I love that combination where, she's, I don't want to say in and out, but, well, anyway, we'll get to that because Michael's going to.
And she has some anger with herself, which I really loved. If you could speak about that a little bit. It would be very easy for this character, I'm trying not to spoil too much, but to direct all of her frustration and anger outward. But a lot of it comes in too.
Well, I mean, I think that's, well, just very briefly, she falls victim to some scammers, and the FBI tells her that, and what they've done, what's so horrible about these scammers is this is where she gets a grandson call, but there's a setup of what her family's like, so it's very believable, I guess, that she would fall for it. But nevertheless, and he ends, because she uses the same password for everything, not just that checking account, it's all gone. Well, no one here
If you take
that.
one message from this novel,
Right. It's a how not to. Yeah, exactly. But it's what she does. The big mistake she makes is out of love. Like that's what makes this crime, the scamming crime, so immoral to me anyway. Where okay, so there are crimes where the criminal takes advantage of your greed or your lust or something else that's not good about you. Here, the very best thing about you is the route that they take to do bad, and so it's humiliating. And I think that's one of the reasons, in answer to Mike's question, that she doesn't blame others because she knows in her heart that it's something in her, even if it's a good thing, and so it's humiliating. So when she goes, the FBI tells her that there's no way to. These scammers originated probably in Romania in some town. Maybe they could identify the actual people, but they'd never get the money back. And that's when she goes to Romania to get her money back. But it's not just that; it's the humiliation. It's to recover, some self-respect.
And you have a human villain who is wonderful because he's a person. It's not just a villain. I loved how you handled him. Along this topic, though, of like the scamming, were you thinking about AI at all? Because your guy has to have talent, and that's gone now. It's about to go away in terms of impersonating the voice.
Okay, that's a terrific, what a great question. Because when I wrote the book, AI wasn't involved in the scamming. And when I wrote the book, like I finished it when recently, in the last 2 years, for sure, 1 year. So since then, the whole scamming operation, because of AI, this wonderful idea, but don't be afraid of it. It's everything will work out great. Because
It's a friend.
yeah, but because of that, as Mike said, now you don't have to. This kid in Romania who is learning English and learning how to, adapt these conversations so they'll work on the fly. So you're not going to need him anymore. So because AI is going to actually do the voices. So that really bothered me because as the book is coming out, technology is moving quickly. So
I think it's a fascinating, sorry to interrupt, but it's a fascinating time capsule, though, because you would not write this book 18 months down the line in the same way, I wouldn't think.
You're so right. And taking it one step further, so the next Chet and Bernie book is called Up on the Rooftop. It comes out in October, but I'm writing the one after that right now, unless my laptop burned up in your car on the way over.
Not in the car.
In which case,
the back room.
In which case, it's gone. But in this one, what I did was, I've kind of come at the whole scamming thing through this, where, in fact, the Parsons who live next door. And so it's the voice of their son Billy. Only, it's Billy, right? But what I did was, it isn't Billy to Chet. He hears, because dog hearing is so incredible, that he's able to, I'm giving the whole stupid thing away, but the book won't be out for another year and a half at least. So anyway,
I love that, though.
Anyway, so that's how I handled it, to just make up for, I was humiliated by the, technological change. And so to get back at them, I've sick Chet on.
I like it. That's the way the awareness, and I think that's the process we go through a lot, where the thing that you feel like you might have missed in the current book drives the next one. I have that quite a bit.
Oh, that's really interesting. So let's go to this book of yours, which I loved, and I couldn't recommend more highly. There's, in terms of similarities between the two, there probably on the surface there aren't many, but underneath, when you get under the hood, we've both done a two-person close point of view novel, which is a format I love, and it's used a lot in crime fiction. Okay, so it's not in first person, like I did this, I did that. It's he did this, he did that. But in third person close, you're kind of right on their shoulder, and Mike is an absolute master of the technique. A lot of people fumble it and they make little mistakes, and that's when I stop. But with him, he's a master of it, and I love it. But he's not at the crude level of crime fiction. You get a thing where, so one of the characters is going to be the good guy and one the bad guy, right? But his is so much more sophisticated than that. And
Thank
it,
you.
and
Wow.
therefore all the thematic stuff that he's got going just merges together beautifully.
Thank you very much. And considering I've been studying your work for years, that's high praise. But I'm glad you like it because I'm just trying to rip off your approach.
No,
So,
no.
in fact, I'm going to embarrass Peter a little bit. This is the first time we've ever met, but years ago, I sent him a couple emails that when I look back on these emails, it's like I was asking him how to write a book. And he kept responding to a stranger and saying, like, you know, he actually gave guidance and feedback. And when I'm embarrassed now that I intruded on your time like that, but my goodness, you were so gracious
Well,
about it.
no, and you wouldn't have, anything I said wouldn't have done anything because you're a natural born talent, and it's obvious just off the page. So, yeah, but thank you.
Thank you.
The emails must have been so finely written that that I couldn't ignore it. Yeah, I had to get on that train. The other thing I really like, well, there's so much, but okay, so like if you're doing like the totem pole of crime fiction, so down at the bottom, but the sine qua non of it is plot. I mean, you just have to have some kind of crackling plot. And for a lot of readers, but no one in here, that's all they want. If the book is lousy writing and the characters are cardboard and it's not about anything, they don't care. It's the plot you have to have. But as you climb up, okay, you get believable characters, you get good writing, you get tone and mood and place, and wonderful on place. Just the the rocky coast of, like, is, you know, there are all these, I mean, the book is, I guess, what's it about? But it basically, okay, at the very top is thematic material of this totem pole. They're about something. And this book, Mike's, is like, I guess it's about like what corruption does, how corruption acts like a poison on, you know, everybody who's getting rained on by it. And you realized at the end that although there's it's so terrible because the world that in this book is symbolized by the rocky coast of Maine is hard enough without that, and why we, you know, need each other not to be corrupt. Anyway, that's what I took away from it. I don't know.
Absolutely. That was the goal. You articulated it much better than I would have. But the island serves as a very nice sort of dramatic microcosm of, you know, universal problems. So it could be any town, it could be any city or state, and the island structure gave me a way to sort of narrow down this community. I was actually thinking it's not a natural parallel, but Stephen King's book Under the Dome, where he literally drops a dome across this community and says, let's see how everybody, you know, plays together. In a way, this is sort of a siege novel. Not literally, but in terms of the way it feels to the characters. I wanted that claustrophobia, and I wanted them to have to deal with the emotions, the tribal emotions, become a big driver of
Right,
it.
well, but you have a limited cast. I mean, you know, in a way, it's sort of like the old-fashioned country house murder, where only X number of people can be involved. You know, what's really interesting is there are several books that have come out this summer, maybe because it's summer, that have a boat where mysterious deaths, more than one person, has happened. Kathy Reich's new book, I'll be talking to her next week, has not one but two.
Two boats
Two
or
boats with
oh, okay.
potential bodies in them and so
All right.
forth.
I was gonna say I've got her on the body count at least.
Yep.
I killed two senators.
Is one. I'm about to talk to Will Dean from England, who has, I have to show you this book, a really astonishing concept, another boat. And I don't know whether it's summer, you know, kind of inspiring us all to go to sea or what, or whether it just
I bet it
suddenly-
was COVID. We were all writing those books during
the
pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of claustrophobia, you're going to see it manifest in different ways, but you're going to see themes of isolation, claustrophobia, and you're going to see political and social ideas run through through those novels, because we were all marinating in the same questions and dealing with the same sort of internal struggles. Peter talked about plot being, you know, you've got to have it at the bottom, but I think of plot as sort of the external journey, and then the interior journey is how the character navigates it.
And in many ways, this could be in Washington, D.C. It is on the, not with a boat necessarily full of
The
bodies.
tidal pool.
But you
huh?
could, you could, floating up by the Lincoln Memorial,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Or not
No,
the
the
Lincoln, the
bodies in it, and
Jefferson,
there you go,
right?
right,
Yep, you
yeah,
could. But, I think you did a wonderful job showing how corruption works the same way, regardless of what's the size of the pond. It can be the same.
Thank you.
And Peter
And-
does the same thing. One of the things I loved about your book was the way that this young boy in Romania is being coached by his uncle about, how to go about conning everybody, and they have scripts, and and the uncle.
I love this character.
Yeah,
I'm so glad you.
I know.
The boy you're talking
Yes.
Dinu.
Yeah, I did too. But the
Well,
uncle's
so-
really kind of
Okay, so
fun
when
too.
I had this idea, from the get-go, I thought it's a one-character point of view thing, Mrs. Plansky in every scene. And I sat down on day one to write, and all of a sudden on came the Romanians. Just so weird. I hadn't planned.
You lead with them.
What?
So you thought
led with them.
you had her. Okay, you had her.
They
and
weren't
then-
even going to have any scenes by themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, it just happened, but with them came a lot of the thematic material, dragging behind them, having to do with the United States still being a beacon to the world, but at the same time a sheep for shearing, and the attraction of it, and just because one of the things this Dinu, this teenage scammer, he loves this country. The fact that all the states have nicknames.
I loved
He
that.
just-
Yes, as
you
he's.
know, he just can't. The fact that we have our own Georgia, because their Georgia over there is a completely different thing. He just he's on YouTube all the time looking up things about Miami, and and his dream, of course, is to get here, and well, that's part of Mrs. Plansky's revenge. So I won't give it away. But
And I when I talk about like a fully realized character, a human character, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You understand, you empathize with the goals of the quote villain in this scenario, even while you watch the price and the pain he is inflicting, and that's because Peter writes complex books about real world issues, and people do not, for the most part, people are not making villainous decisions in a vacuum. There is some force of desperation or leverage that makes them think it's a simple plan, the Scott Smith book. It's like, if I just keep this bag of money, who does it hurt? And I know who it helps. And then you watch the ripples of that. But most of us believe we are the good guys, and,
Yes,
and you get that in your villain.
yeah. That's a great point. I don't think even some of the great villains of history, not even, probably that's one of the things that drove them so that they were right,
Yes.
and good.
Everyone wants to be the hero of his own story.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true. But the other thing about this book that I think is so great is that Mrs. Plansky is already being punked by her family before the whole Romanian thing happens. So she has a daughter, Nina, is that her name?
Yes.
And one of the Nina has been married 3 times and has a new boyfriend, and they have a scheme. And one of the things I loved about Mrs. Plansky, one of my absolute favorite lines in the book, after Mrs. Plansky realizes that she's going to end up subscribing to this, and she says at the end of the chapter, she says, Nina is in love with love, and Matthew is in love with himself. That's the dynamic. But I thought that
I remember that line.
Yeah, I thought it was so beautifully and then she has a son who's amazingly here in Arizona. I appreciate all the Arizona stuff. It's really great. And the son is clearly falling into some, nest of snakes. And so he too is going to need money. So Mrs. Plansky's kind of being rolled as the book moves along before the Romanians
And then
actually
there's
get her.
Her 98-year-old dad,
Oh.
who lives in a top-of-the-line, luxurious, after, what do they call it, assisted care living place in Florida, which of course he can't afford. So she's paying for that too. But
Everyone is bleeding her.
yeah, everyone is bleeding her,
yes.
but she's okay with it. But one of the things about a character like him, I've run into this a few times in my career before. As soon as he steps on the stage, he's ready to take over the whole book. you have to keep him on a tight leash
Yes.
because you want to write about him all the time because he's funny and rude and crude and unexpected at all times and a big, larger than life in some ways. He'll take your book away.
Do you have a bunch of pages on the cutting room floor where you let him run, or at this point do you have enough muscle memory that you feel him start to go so early that you don't?
I do. That's
Okay.
it's the second one. I feel him, and we're going to have to just move him off as much as we can.
But if this was your second or third book, if we go back in time, would you have gone farther along with him and then maybe realized in edits, second or third draft, I need to dial him back?
Or maybe not realized.
Or not realized at all? Yes.
And
Okay.
that would be me. Right? And then when the editor said, well, what do you think dialing back? And then I'd probably fight against it, right? I'd make every mistake in the book, literally and figuratively.
Well, the other fortunate thing is that Peter has written a book set in Romania. I have actually been to Romania and I have been to the mountains, and I can tell you did a pretty good job.
Thank you. Well, that's one of the reasons, the beauty of it. But another is it's a Romance language. If I'd sent Mrs. Plansky to Czechoslovakia, she couldn't read the road signs or a little thing, and there you can make a little bit of sense of stuff. And she needed to be able to read some road signs.
It's not even as tough as Portuguese, which is, I think, the hardest of all
It's
the
very-
Romance languages.
Well, we see,
Brilliant.
and we hear it I live on Cape Cod. You hear it all the time. Mostly Brazilians, but also Portuguese people.
The seasonal
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
workforce.
So, Michael, let's go back to your book. Why don't you give us a little pitch to sort of set it up here? Michael's book is our July crime book of the month, and Peter's book is our August cozy crimes book of the month. And I hate putting labels on books, like calling it a cozy crime, but that we have only so many categories, and that's the one that happened to fit the best because I want everybody to read it.
Thank you.
I'm bad with the elevator pitch, so I'll just give you the opening scene. It's very cheerful. A lobster man who's just back from 15 years in prison for killing his own father notices a luxury yacht that's kind of adrift, and he rows out and finds 7 more bodies. So with that bit of fun and good cheer, it really went on its own way there. The inspiration for it is all the thematic elements that, Peter was discussing. And then a deep love of Maine. I live in Maine half the year, and I think the coast of Maine, actually interior Maine, is probably creepier to me. But I love settings where it's a place that actively pushes back on characters. And Maine is definitely that. It looks idyllic and beautiful. It is. But then there's a whole different toughness there. And I wanted it to be a story about identity too. And who gets to claim it. And I really think that we're in a moment where everyone wants to say this town is X or Y based on their perception of history. And I would argue, no, it's a little more nuanced. Like, neither person is wrong. It depends on your experience. And so how do you wrestle with a community's history? That was the other thing I really wanted to dig into.
So tell us a little more about your main character. I mean, you have a sort of principal point of view character.
Yeah, so Israel Pike is a lobsterman who's coming back to this island where his father is beloved, and Israel knows a little bit more about his father's reality. So again, it's that, what's the thing beneath the surface? And then the second point of view is a kid named Lyman Rankin, who's 12 years old, has an abusive father, terrible home life. And Lyman is one of my favorite characters I've ever written because, he's powerless, but he's hopeful, and he pushes back. And I think that's something that's really noble and heroic about kids in tough circumstances, terrible circumstances. It's how do they hold hope? And all of the adults, many of the adults in the book are very cynical. And it's like, okay, in a world of cynical adults and, bad luck, how do you find your idea of hope and beauty? And he finds it with a very unlikely partner, but writing the two of them together, I can't really describe her without giving a lot away, but the two of them together were just scenes that, to Peter's point about, they can threaten to run away with the book. Sometimes it's good, though. So I didn't know that relationship would be as important as it was, I was picturing the story being Israel Pike's. And then Lyman came along, and I said, oh, these two have a little extra magic. And I don't know what your experience is, but that's the most fun thing about writing to me is when you feel like, okay, we're going to go here and turn left. And the book says, no, you're going right. You know, you're not even facing the right direction. I love that.
That is one of there are a lot of hard things about it, but then there are these surprises that come out of the blue, right? Where you've opened up something you didn't think you were. And that, okay, so Lyman, I think he's 12 years old, right? Yeah. So, what?
Good memory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing with writing kids, it's really important in your mind anyway to have, because Dinu, for example, is 16, and the difference between them, those 4 years, is huge.
Huge.
And so you have to make kids believable, which so many writers stumble on. And just do things where it's impossible. Like just a kid would never think like that. But Lyman, even in distress and as difficult as his situation is, I mean, he's believable, on every line, and
Thank you.
And you really, so this is like going back to this thing I bored you with earlier about the two character point of view things. So when I was a kid, I had this picture book, and it was about these two miners. And okay, they could be in Bisbee, say, and they're Bisbee as it used to be, and they're digging in the same mountain but from different directions, and they get closer. Okay, these two miners, by the way, as I remember them, they were very clean, and looked cheerful all the time. So they're digging with their picks, and then there's the middle page. The climax is where you see the big hole one is dug and the big cavern the other, and in between now is just a tiny little sliver of rock and one more swing of the pickaxe, and they're together. Okay, so in both books, Mike's and mine, this kid and the older person, you see them, doing their mining, and then
That's exactly how it goes.
and then they're going to come together. And I love that book. I guess I got the idea from this picture book when I was 6 years old. So
It's a beautiful description of the structure, and it brings an inherent level of suspense that's not really related or dependent on plot maneuvers, because people know, the audience intuits that these characters must meet, but they don't know how or when or why or at what cost.
yes, but you still haven't done anything cheating. There's no cheating in that. Cheating is like in a movie when you go to the movie and all of a sudden the villain who you haven't met, it comes on the screen, but you're only seeing his feet walking.
Yeah,
Okay, as soon as you see that, get your money back, because you're not seeing first rate. Or if you're reading a book and it's there's a lot of interior stuff from someone's mind, but not everything. So there's some things that you don't get, that are only being held back because if the writer told you about them now, the book is over. Yeah, I avoid that too. But it worked when you wanted them to come together so badly, Israel and Lyman. And I was thinking, what circumstances is it going to be? How can they both? Well, I'm not going to survive. I'm not going to give anything away, but your heart.
I kept thinking they would bump into each other, sorry to interrupt, but earlier than they did.
Yeah, you should.
And it's one of those things where I feel like, okay, once you've done it enough times, once you've seen a novel from beginning to end, I would have rushed that meeting 10 years ago. And then you get a little more confidence of, if I'm doing everything else well, the reader's still with me. And so I don't need to force anything. I don't need to rush
But as a
anything.
reader, I can say that I kept wondering exactly where we were going. Why are the bodies out there? How did they die? Did Israel, why did he kill his father? What's up with the kid? I love the pacing because, it's suspenseful and it's tense, but it also is sort of leisurely. You don't show your hand too early.
But not in a bad way. And the fact that Israel, like when you find out about the dad and what happened and all that, it's natural that that's when you would find it out. Earlier, it would have been unnatural to have found out earlier, because of the way he has this extremely complex interior life and history, and has buried there's a lot of stuff that he doesn't think about. So, and he's also very stoical too, extremely. And so that combo means that certain things aren't going to come out of them easily.
I was thinking from a structure standpoint, I actually was thinking of Casablanca with this, which people won't make that bridge, but the early scenes there, you know Rick and Ilsa have a past. You know it involves Paris. You know that he doesn't want to hear that damn song until she can hear it, and then he says, if she can take it, I can too. But they hold off until the middle of the movie and give you one big flashback. And I'm usually someone who kind of drips backstory through, but I thought, no, this is like the Casablanca structure, where I'm going to hold back on a lot of it and then just give it to you all.
Yeah. I like that a lot.
I did too. So, Michael, you live partly in Indiana and partly in Maine. Do you find that your stories shape differently depending on where you're setting them? Because not every book you write is in Maine.
No, it's a really good question. The only time I've ever written about Indiana, or my hometown at least, is a book that comes out next spring under the Scott Carson name. So I've gone 20 years of writing without, writing about my hometown. I've written about lots of other places, and I think I'm always looking for those, as I said, the places I'm drawn to setting as character that can push back. Maine has it. I've written about Montana, Florida during a hurricane in the 30s. So I like the nice, dark and stormy night books, I guess.
So here's the part where we get to talk about the author's backstory. So Michael has a backstory, which is that he has written several books with supernatural or horror elements and has adopted another name called Scott Carson. There's a few copies of one of the books up front to differentiate. You're sort of like Ruth Rendell. Remember when she started writing as Barbara Vine to distinguish, or many of you remember Elizabeth Peters, who also wrote as Barbara Michaels, to distinguish the.
Or this Peter Abrahams
general tone.
guy.
Well, I was going to get to that. No, he's coming. But Scott Carson. So tell us a little bit about Scott Carson, because Michael comes out here as Scott in addition to coming as Michael.
You basically nailed it. It was trying to create some clarity for the audience in terms of, okay, if you like the, ghost supernatural approach, if you're the Stephen King kind of reader, then, Scott will be your guy. And if a more traditional crime novel is more your pace, then Koryta will hopefully be your guy, because it is, I think, a challenge for readers and booksellers and publishers to say, we don't know this time what it's going to be. And you can probably speak to that far more eloquently. And
I don't have any trouble with it at all. I just tell people, but
so I hallucinated a difficulty.
right. Well, no, but in general, you are correct. In general, booksellers like to put labels on books. We try very hard not to label anything. We do differentiate between the science fiction, maybe, and the romance, but as far as everything else goes, it just goes into fiction. But it's also true with digital book selling, is that there are actual assigned codes for different kinds of books. And if they're not there, if you're buying from Amazon or whatever it might be, then your book will be improperly classified. And I hate that, because I think it forces books into categories where people will miss them if they think that's not a category that interests them. So I hate to say it's just horror, because many of you will go, I don't want to read horror,
Yeah, I don't think
of my
yeah, I don't really think of it as horror at all.
No.
Actually, I mean, the next one, which is called Lost Man's Lane, it's a coming of age story set in 1999 and is probably more inspired by like John Irving than horror. There are some spooky elements to it, definitely, but
you like the supernatural. That's
I love the
probably
supernatural.
a fair way of putting it.
Absolutely.
So we can then talk about Peter Abrahams, because I fell in love with Peter Abrahams before he ever became Spencer Quinn.
Thank you. And it's been a big help. One of my problems is that going back to the labeling part, there's something in me that won't get in the box. I just,
Sure.
even if I'm told get in the box and everything will be great, I still won't do it. So I've roamed around in my career through every possible part of crime fiction. No supernatural though. Maybe once. Jesus. But here's what happened. Okay, the Spencer Quinn name. So I wrote a lot of books under Peter Abrahams. First, I did 17 standalone novels that were all different, trying this and that and the other. Oblivion was one, End of Story.
I love that book.
Thank you. The Fan was made into this movie.
One is set here in Arizona, which is wonderful.
What?
I can't remember.
Oh,
There's Wildest Dreams.
That's the one where I fell in love with Arizona and
Right.
knew I wanted to do more in Arizona.
Great cover with like a suitcase on the highway.
Yeah,
right?
That's
suitcase
right.
in the highway, and
Yeah.
that's the one that's sort of this disguised cowboy one that I did. But then when I had the idea to do tell us a series through the point of view of a dog, and the important thing was this dog is not a talking dog, not a human wrapped in a dog suit. It's as canine, Chet is as canine as I could make him. But therefore, I mean, everything changes because of that if you really stick to the formula religiously. For example, I mean, he's an unreliable narrator, obviously, and you throw that into a traditional crime fiction, where you're collecting these clues and putting them in logical order.
Right.
Well, first of all, he
comes
can't
out.
put clues in logical order, but he isn't going to identify a clue if there's a Cheeto under the sofa at the same time, and he'll miss it. But so it made it challenging, but at the same time, it opened up. It was like a big bang. I'm not comparing my work to the creation of the universe. I'm just saying it was like a big bang and the effects. I'm still figuring out things you can do because of that form, even now, which is because people say, "How are you still interested?" I mean, I love. And that's one of the reasons I love writing Chet and Bernard, but the main one is I love writing the voice. I just can't stop. But so I wrote the first, and I did some writing for children. I wrote that Echo Falls series that I was pretty happy with for middle graders. But then I had the idea of Doggone It, this first, and I wrote it and I sent it into my agent, and she said, "Well, there's humor in your other books. How did she put it? But it's icier." I think I took it as a compliment. And then she said, "And also this is first person. You haven't done that before. It's in the dog. Maybe it won't find the audience. What about a pseudonym?" I really didn't like the idea, but if someone on the business side tells me something, I do it. That's another one of my failings. So, but I thought, well, okay, we'll do it because it's going to be 2 books, and then so I didn't realize.
You wouldn't have to deal with it long, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't have to deal with it long, and then I'd be back. It was just a little, and so now it took over. And not only that, but when I want to write something different, it's fine with the marketing people, but they want this other name on it.
See, this is my dream. I want my pseudonym to kill me.
Yeah.
As long as he keeps producing, that's fine. I think it's actually worked out really well if that happens. When they say we don't want Peter, we want Spencer.
Yeah.
Although on like a kind of serious note, for a very weird question, is there a point where that frustrates you and you say, like this book, which to me is a classic Peter Abrahams book, do you want to go back and have the other name on any level, or do you just not care because the story is out there?
Okay, I tell myself that a smart person wouldn't care, but I care.
Yeah.
So, because look, I'm looking at my gravestone and someone looks at it and they say it's Peter Abrahams, and they might say, "Well, what did he do?" Because they don't know that I'm not going to have Peter Abrahams, aka Spencer Quinn.
I told my wife I want front and back. So if you're looking at it from one side, you get Koryta, you walk around, and hey, there's Carson.
Okay, so this has come up. It's a thing. I love it.
Maybe what you need is an obelisk, and then you could have it
Yeah,
on different sides, which would be great.
Yeah.
So just to show you how amazing Peter is, one of my favorite books, and I can't remember titles anymore, but Peter will be able to tell us. We start out with a man that we know is dying, and remember the guy he has
Oblivion?
Oblivion.
Yes.
Right.
Oh no, you're talking about nerve damage, the asbestos one.
I'm talking about the asbestos one. So all the way through the book, while he's working along and he has this mission in the whole book, you as the reader are hoping that somehow miraculously his asbestos lung disease will go away.
Well, that's around when I decided that I'm going to kill the good guy sometimes, the hero, because
You have to.
yeah, I mean, look what's going on around us, right? You know, you want, but what that book, okay, Nerve Damage, it's a long time ago now, but yes, he's dying and that, but what, so I can't remember how I engineered this, but you know that obituaries of even semi-prominent people are written ahead of time. You know, they're ready to go. You know, like if I almost was going to say a political figure and get myself in huge trouble. If X died today, they're ready, you know, to run with it. So he has this death sentence, and he gets to see ahead of time, just not legally, but someone leaks it to him, sort of, in the journalistic business, his obituary, and there's a mistake in it. And he starts pulling at that thread about something in his life. There's a mistake. But what was wrong is his understanding of what happened. And so the book is really, the crime solving has to do with the clock is ticking because is he going to figure out blah, blah, blah. You see what I'm getting at.
It's a beautiful book. Also, Oblivion was one of that, to me, was just kind of a seminal achievement. I think I can disclose now I was judging for the Seamus Awards when that came along. I think you won it, I believe, as I recall. You were certainly nominated.
Okay, I think maybe. Thank you.
But I saw that book come through, and I was familiar with Peter's work, but it was just such an exquisite emotional journey. And I love you had a talisman for this kind of experimental medicine, as I recall. It was about like a wafer kind of size. And doesn't he put it in under his pillow at night? Yeah. So it's closer to, it's just, there's beautiful, deeply emotional writing in all of his books. And you have that the tension is there, that, you know, the plot twists are there. But there's a reason that Mr. Stephen King says Peter Abrahams is my favorite American suspense novelist. I mean, that's, what did that feel like when you heard that?
I mean, it felt amazing to me. I mean, I was just, I didn't know him, right? But then now I do. I wouldn't say we're friendly. I think we like each other. We don't spend much time together or anything like that. I haven't seen him in years socially. And but okay, so I mean, well, should I tell this? No.
Tell the story.
Okay, so I had a book called The Fan, which is a crime fiction book that took place in the world of professional baseball. And one morning, a friend of mine, one of my tennis buddies said, "Hey, were you watching the Red Sox game last night?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, they had a rain delay. And during the delay, they were talking to Stephen King, and they asked him what's his favorite baseball novel. And he said The Fan by Peter Abrahams, which had just come out, or, you know, and I didn't know, I had no clue. So my editor, you know, said, would you look at his next book? And that's when he did this, you know, and I was bowled over, and I thanked him.
And on writing, King has a list of the books he's read recently that he thought were, you know, top notch. And I believe you have more books on that list than any other writer. If not, you are second or third place, but I think you have the most. And I think that is very, it's deserved, but also just how cool and special that is, because that book is, you know, iconic, and it will be around forever. And I think that a writer that great, who is giving inspiration to other writers up and coming and saying, like, go look at this guy's work if you want to do it well, is really special.
Well, yes, thank you. And I mean, if there was ever a natural born writer, it's him, you know, who's deeply in touch with whatever's going on below the surface of American life. I mean, it just bubbles up through him in the most exciting, scary ways. It's terrific, you know, an amazing force.
Isn't it exciting to hear from two writers who you can't pigeonhole? You know, their works are different. You're always surprised by what they do. You know, too often, I read something depressing today about the reemergence or the whatever renaissance of Barnes and Noble, and one of the comments,
the Wall Street Journal piece. Yeah.
One of the comments was, in the first place, they're wrong that, you know, book sales here actually went up during the pandemic by a considerable amount. They didn't go down. But that's because Barnes and Noble doesn't write to you like I do. So, so you all came in, or we delivered books to you. But anyway, it talked about how the business is being taken over more and more by just a few bestsellers. And I resist that. I really want to find for you books that are not obvious, that are not on everybody's list, that are a different reading experience where you can be surprised. And we have here two bestsellers, but the good news is their work is all different. So, when I say Michael Koryta's coming, you don't go, oh, look, it's Jack Reacher again. Or when Peter's here, it's always going to be something different. Are your older books still in print? Are they just digital, or are
I
they?
think we're working on this, but some are being reprinted by Open Road, I think it's called.
Great, yeah, Open Road Media.
But
yeah.
and then we're working on copyright things with some of the others. Everything's on digital, but I think a lot will be hard to find in paperback now.
Well, I'm hoping for you all that one of these days you'll be able to read your way through the Peter Abrahams list, as I have done, and which Michael has done.
I have not missed one.
Because the books and books like that don't really date. You have to make a few allowances for events or maybe that have changed some.
Well, technology, too, as you pointed out. You date the book. But does that ruin a book? Like, in Dickens, there were no telephones and.
No, if you go back and read, like Michael Connolly's book, The Poet, turns on this digital camera that now would see. I mean, everyone's got a superior thing on their phone, but does that mean the poet is not going to hold the reader? Absolutely not.
No, it just kind of merges more towards historical fiction.
Yeah.
You have to read it that way. I'm also really opposed to this current thing that a lot of publishers are doing where they're sanitizing or cleaning up, books in order to bring them to a modern sensibility.
The reader is sophisticated enough to figure that out.
I mean, try imagining, that Raymond Chandler cleaned up. It's just, he's really offensive in all kinds of ways.
He's on somebody's list. You can, it's guaranteed. Yeah. And it's so patronizing to the reader.
Absolutely.
Actually, do you remember the Reverend Boulder? Any of you besides me know what the word boulderized means? Any of you know what the word boulderized means? Okay, so in the Victorian era, another moment of woke purity, whatever it is, there was a Reverend, I think his name was Chester, but I might be wrong. Anyway, whatever his name was, Reverend Boulder. And he went through and he cleaned up books, to make them less offensive, the whole 9 yards. And from that, we get the verb boulderize. And I remember years ago, there was an entire New York Times crossword puzzle. And there was always the key word in those puzzles that I used to have a roommate when I was in library school, and we used to time each other with a challenge. Which of us could get to the end of the New York Times crossword puzzle first? And the key word for one of them was boulder, or boulderize, whatever it is. And then all the clues related to censorship or whatever it all is. And here we are again. People never seem to get it.
We're going to protect the reader from their own thoughts.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Patrick
it's so misguided.
Talking to Dame Denise Mina on Tuesday she'll be in Scotland, will be here. And she's written a book, Three Fires, I think it's called. But basically it's about Savonarola and his attempt to do this in Florence and the book burnings and the whole bit. But she manages to use the language and make it so current that you could think, you could think you were in Texas right at this moment, where much of this fight is going on. And, I love the way that she's taken, we're in the 1400s, but she's applying it to today. And it really works. And the way she uses the language really works. But she just points out that every time there's an effort to censor things or to, boulderize things, it never lasts very long.
No. Let's hope.
Just a side note on the Victorians, they also had a version of King Lear where Cordelia doesn't die. Because they couldn't, so they tacked a happy ending. They were better than Shakespeare. That's it.
And Shakespeare actually hardly had an original plot. It was what he did with it that really mattered, because he was a great borrower.
Yeah, I mean, if I was at a college reunion, a huge number. recently, and
I can beat you on that.
not by much. But one of the guys was telling me that there's so little reading of Shakespeare now, like in the kids coming in and I mean, he built half the language. How
Yeah.
can you? You can't. How can you ignore him? I don't get
No,
it.
but that may come around because years and years ago, I think I'm writing a current book news for you, which I hope I'll get if I can type by Tuesday. And there's a reimagining of some Greek mythology. And back when I was a kid in the 5th grade, I'd read my way through the entire Kerr Island School and Winnetka, Illinois library. And the only book that the librarian had for me was Bullfinch's Mythology, which was considered too sophisticated because of the really bad things that the Greek gods got up to for a person who was 9 or 10 years old. But they let me read it because there wasn't anything else. And, and it really, if you know the Greek myths, it really informs, your whole not reading,
much of
understanding,
the rest of your
whatever it
reading
all
life,
is.
yeah.
And then it went away. So years later, probably maybe when was it, 15 or 20 years ago, I am walking in El Paso, Texas at a Left Coast Crime Conference with Rick Riordan. Rick Riordan, who wrote paperback crime novels and won 2 or 3 awards, and was a really good writer. And we're strolling along, and he said to me, "So what do you know about Greek mythology?" I said, "Bullfinches." I said, "Age of Fable, I have it down." And he said, "What would you think?" He said, "If I thought about how to write a Greek myth for my 9 or 10-year-old, because I was thinking he wanted a
Does he cut you
story."
royalty checks?
And I said to him, "What a great idea, whatever." But what's happened is,
amusement
wait, but what's happened is, if you look at the stuff coming out, he has now fostered a whole series of adult novels. We have not only Greek mythology, but the Greek playwrights. So we have Clytemnestra, we have Psyche and Eros, we have Ariadne, we have, and so I'm hoping, since the Greeks have come back, I'm hoping that Shakespeare will have
Well,
a
also,
moment.
yeah, I love
Let
the
me
idea.
write your
I
Rick.
wouldn't count Bill out just yet.
Yeah,
no.
yeah.
He's still
Maybe
got a
I'll
fighting
write you Rick
chance.
and say, time to move on. Let's do Shakespeare. But no, seriously, I think, it's a whole underpinning of the English language in so much of what we understand about the world.
Well, if we can get back, I mean, that brings me back to what Mike brought up at the very beginning about AI. And so my question for you is, do you think there's going to come a day when AI can write you?
It's going to sound a lot like me, but it will not have, I don't think, the emotional investment. I think that's going to be the hardest thing to fake. That said, I mean, it's terrifying. I'm in the Writers Guild on the screenwriting side. I mean, this is one of the reasons we're on strike. It is very, very good right now at mimicking style. And this is the dumbest it will ever be. This is the worst it will ever be. And when you get to, there's a good podcast called Strike Talk with a producer named Billy Ray, and he interviews an AI in the one that just came out on Friday, and he's having it do Morgan Freeman's voice, and I forget who else. But I mean, it's pretty chilling stuff, really.
It is chilling stuff, but Dave Barry and I were talking about that when he was here in May, and he said no matter how good they get, he said it won't have my sense of humor. And
see,
I'm hoping that will be true.
And the emotional commitment. I mean, that's what I'm counting on too, that these ineffable things can't be replicated. But on the other hand, as what Mike just said, this is the dumbest. It's very early and it's happening. So a year ago, there was nothing. We weren't talking about it except very speculatively, and now it's out there.
There's a book that I would recommend by a guy named Mo Gaudat, who was he was the president of Google's emerging technology, their AI division, and he left. He was very concerned about it. He wrote a book 2 years ago called Scary Smart. It kind of takes you back into what they were doing, what they were concerned with. And he said the pact sort of between these companies was you would never put it on the open internet, and you would never allow it to code for itself. You would always need a human to give it a prompt. And what do we do? It's on the open internet right now, and it's prompting itself. It's worth reading. It really is worth reading.
What's the name of the computer in Space Odyssey?
Hal.
Hal.
Open the pod door.
Yeah,
Yes.
Hal. Here comes Hal.
Yeah.
It's really scary, right? What is the state that when the machine and the brain become one? What's it called? There's a name for
Yeah,
it.
there's a,
Yes, there is. When the narrow link.
Anyway, a lot of science fiction writers have, written about
Yeah.
moving, and will that happen? Will we obsolete ourselves? And maybe if it keeps getting hotter, maybe only machines will be able to actually live on Earth, as we are finding out. On that cheerful note, why don't
Yeah.
why don't we take questions?
Suddenly, my book with all the murders makes you feel really good.
That's right. And it's cold up there in Maine. You're on the water. Yay, it's all wonderful. And you're in the mountains in Romania where it's also chilly. I do think, are you a motorcycle guy?
well, I've been on them, but I didn't, not for, yes, I've been, but not for years.
I don't think you could have written Mrs. Plansky's motorcycle ride if you weren't yourself.
No, and she,
Yeah.
of course, had a lot when she was out working on a ranch out west as a teenager. That's when one of the wranglers taught her this and that, Mrs. Plansky.
It's really, really a great stage, right? And this is a book where I mentioned cozy crime, but in fact, there is no label that actually applies to Mrs. Plansky. So just forget that. It's just a way that I can sell 30 more copies of the book. So by calling it that, but it doesn't have anything to do with it. So who would like Peter take over and call for questions and all like that?
Oh, we're calling for questions. Oh, well, who's
Christina.
Christine in the back? Oh, thank you. There's a whole story which I'll really make abbreviated. How am I going to do this? Well, no. Okay, so here, people often ask, "How did you get the idea for a book?" And I've written all these books. I think this is the 45th, but if you count the children's, the young, so you don't do that. But so it's some big number, and people always say, "How'd you get the idea?" And I always say it came out of the blue, and their eyes glaze over, and because they're looking for an interesting, something useful. But with this one, I can sort of say, okay, so my dad died in spring of 2020, but he at the age of almost 2 weeks from being 97, and he was in excellent health, physically and mentally. I mean, excellent, not just for an old guy, but right to the end. But a few years before, he got a call. He picked up the phone, and the voice said, "Hello, Grandpa." And my dad said, "Jake." And the voice said, "Yeah, it's me, Jake. I'm in trouble," and proceeded to tell this story. Okay, cut to my dad's putting on his jacket, and his wife says, "Ed, where are you going?" And he says, "To the bank, because Jake's in trouble and he needs some money." At that point, they called Jake, and he wasn't this Jake, the in quotes Jake. And so that was the end of that. I totally forgot about that. Kept on writing Chet and Bernie, and then one day, a couple of years later, I was on the bike path. I do a lot of biking, especially in the winter when there's no one on the bike path, because then it's like a kind of dystopia because you're all alone, but it's a utopia. Because, it's beautiful, you're all alone. It's great, like Last of Us, except it's good and no one bites you. So yeah, not yet. Yeah, in your Supernatural, they would, and that's where the story would go. Anyway, the idea for Mrs. Plansky came to me in a rush. The whole thing, everything I've already said, including her name, but I hadn't connected it to my dad at all. And I thought, where did I get this name Plansky? And suddenly I remembered. My dad and I went to the same college, only in different eras, a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. And so when he went, the Navy sent him there because he ended up being a captain of a sub chaser in the English Channel, fighting Nazis. And I went to the same college, but when he was there, he ran cross country, and the coach was this guy who was a really well-known New England athlete, or even nationally, back after World War I, named Tony Plansky. When I went to college, Tony Plansky was still the track coach, only now there was a building named after him, and my dad had told me funny stories about Tony Plansky. And so all of a sudden I realized when I came back from that bike ride, Plansky is the road back to where I got this idea. You dumbass! Why didn't you think of that? So
the subconscious is an amazing thing, isn't it?
And so that's how I got the name Plansky. But it's absolutely perfect for her, I thought. And then right away I decided that she was going to be called Mrs. Plansky, not by her friends, but by the third person voice, to establish that she's a proper kind of woman and give us a little distance. So there's a very long answer to your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michael, do you write for any TV shows?
I can't right now, but I'm trying to. So we've been on strike since May 1st. I had just actually delivered the pilot for An Honest Man. Sold that. Thank you. Sold that, and I'm adapting it for. I don't know if you guys watched Mayor of Easttown.
Loved it.
It's the same.
Same people. Oh,
Yeah,
good for
same
you.
people.
That's great.
And the producer also did No Country for Old Men, which
That's
I
great.
thought was fantastic. So I am eager to get back to it, and you know, we'll see.
That's
I'm
good for
happy-
you.
I'm happy to
Congratulations.
say that Michael wrote his first screenplay while he was here
I was
as
on my
a writer in residence.
residency. Yes.
Yep.
What was the movie?
The movie was Those Who Wish Me Dead. My script was a little bit different than what made the screen, but
Yes.
I wrote
Nonetheless-
I wrote a couple of my favorite scenes that were not in the book, and did make the film. I had a little rental house not far away, and then I would come in here at night and interview great writers and hang out with Barbara, and it was fantastic. It was a great experience, and anytime you want me back, you'll hear squealing tires as I pull out of, my
Right.
driveway in
We're
Maine.
going to go back to our writer in residence program. Diana Gabaldon and we combined to have one, and we've had some wonderful authors over the years, but we had to let it go during COVID, as you might imagine. But we're going to reinstitute it this year. It's amazing how many people who live in, say, Maine will come to Scottsdale in February. So we don't actually have this program in July, but I think
Not
it's
chugging water in February.
no, but it's harder. But we will work on it. Yes.
Do your own dogs give you any inspiration for anything that happened with Jet?
It would be very hard to say directly, like, make a to B connection, but I could never have written. I mean, we've had dogs always, and now we have two, Dottie and Pearl, and but it's through osmosis. So just being with them, I see a lot of stuff, and as you do too. It just finds its way in. But there isn't any. Okay, there's one specific thing that really opened my eyes. This was a number of years ago when we had a dog named Charlie, he was a golden retriever, but beautiful. He had this beautiful big head, and he was gorgeous. The stupidest dog we've by far we've ever had.
Dumb blonde dog.
Dumb
Well,
blonde, yeah, gorgeous. No, the other dogs would catch little animals and bring them to him. He couldn't catch anything himself. So, but I would.
That's how beauty has worked for a long time, by the way.
Yeah, right. It's the best thing to have. Okay, that's all you need. So I would watch. Okay, one thing that happened though with him, so we'd get either UPS or FedEx deliveries, but I would notice that he would not run. He would amble down to the road when FedEx was coming, but not UPS. But it was before they even appeared, was the point. He would amble down to the road, and there was no one there. Then FedEx would appear, and he would be there when the FedEx guy. If the UPS guy came around, he hadn't gone. And I finally realized there was a bridge that you can't see from our house that these trucks passed. The FedEx guy gave him a biscuit every time. He could hear the difference between the trucks and only went down. And when I realized that that's what had to be happening, I thought, oh boy, it's almost like it's not supernatural, but it is for us. If we're the baseline, then it is supernatural. So in that sense, yes, and that opened the door to in my mind, to a lot of what goes on.
Peter and I have exchanged dog pictures over time. I have 2 videos to show you at dinner. You're going to be so pleased. But
Thank you.
So, yeah, definitely. Yes.
Well, AI may be able to write plots, but I dare say they will never come up with Mrs. Plansky's lovely term of double dip.
That's right. On the tour, where I haven't had the pleasure of having Michael here or anyone, but so I've been doing a bit of reading from the, just so I don't blab. But what I've instead of reading the beginning, there are 2 sex scenes, quite short in the book, and I've been reading those.
Proving that sex sells. Still, right.
That's what I'm hoping.
But actually, one of Mrs. Plansky's nicest qualities was how much she loved her husband, Norm, and who has died. She's a widow, but there's some really wonderful moments where she's recalling Norm. And I remember the thing that was the most poignant was they had left where they used to live and moved to this big house in Florida. It had a great tree outside. And she could still, she said, smell Norman in the house for a time after he died. And one morning she woke up and she couldn't, and the house was on the market by lunchtime. And I thought that was really another one of those amazing moments reading it.
Have you read Stuart Onan's Emily Alone?
No, I haven't.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book, but it at times made me think. Mrs. Plansky made me think
Oh, that's
of Emily,
interesting.
so I think you'd enjoy it.
I've met him and know him, but I haven't seen him in years, actually.
Either of you, what is your process for
I can't say that I have any real research approach. It's trying to be honest about where they are emotionally and intellectually, and not write down, because when you're 12 years old, you actually have a pretty sophisticated understanding of the world. You don't articulate it necessarily in the same way, but you don't feel like a child all the time. And I think in my experience as a private investigator, I did a lot of, had some child welfare cases that were awful, terrible experiences, but that sort of informed Lyman and his world, and knowing the reality of, how a kid tries to just survive in that scenario, let alone still have a hope to thrive. So I don't know if that's an answer or not, but I can't say I've ever really researched. I'm not testing it. I'm not saying, hey, 12-year-old, tell me if this holds up.
I, I don't. I think that's a terrific answer, by the way. I two things. Well, I've had kids of my own, to the number of 4, but this is the incredible. Like, I was once a kid too. Hard to believe. No, but yeah, but well, you see, I do kind of.
Yeah.
And that, so like let's say we're a tree, the rings when you saw the, so the 13-year-old or 12-year-old ring is in there, and I can kind of get to it, and that's it. But that's a pathetic answer, really, because there's no research involved that you would call research, and that's what you're asking about. But
I love the that metaphor. It's also when you're writing anyone who is not you, that's one of the great joys of it, is you try to get in. I think of the line in To Kill a Mockingbird. You get inside someone's skin and walk around in it. That's the privilege we have as writers and as readers. So it's just trying to understand, okay, what would be the points of emotional connection here? How do they see the world? What is the biggest concern they have on this day? And then at that point, you add kind of another ring. But childhood, you remember the way you felt about certain things. You remember, there's some, it won't show up in the book, but you have an incredible scene, I don't remember the book, where a guy is bringing a bottle of wine to someone, and it's the first time he's ever been in the wine cellar, and he looks around and he notices there's white and there's red, and he has in a paper bag, it's pink, and he becomes embarrassed of it, and he breaks it intentionally so he won't have to give it to the person who actually knows wine. And I always thought that was just an extraordinary scene, because he builds this suspense where you kind of, it's that cringe thing where you're feeling the potential embarrassment, and then again it's like, oh, there's a way that he can attempt to solve this. And so I think it's about emotional memory. That's when I would say I can really dial in with a kid who has a very different experience from my own.
yeah, I think that, and you see, and if you have kids, of course, and you see them, especially in that age we're talking about, where they're on their own much more, and maybe you one day are going to football practice to pick up your son, and he's obviously been in a fight, and the coach is coming over, and all of a sudden the next conversation you're going to understand a lot about how your small town works, so I mean, that kind of, you learn a lot, and then you have to kind of. But Gina, asked on your question, like I do remember when I wrote that series, the Echo Falls series, and the girl Ingrid is 13, and my daughter Rosie, I think, was 12 or 13 at the time, and she's a marvelous writer. She's a journalist now, but she Rosie Gray is her name, but. So for years I would, if I finished a chapter, I'd put it on the kitchen table, and anybody in the family who wanted could read it and make marks on it. And my wife often did, but the way I would do on someone else's, in light pencil, very tentatively. Okay, Rosie would take a red pen and she's slashing through things. And she's rewriting, and I began to notice that what she's rewriting is better than what I had. Yeah. So in fact, in that sense, yeah, I have done some research. Yeah.
I'm struck by the tragic loss of a probably decent rosé in this stuff. Oh, well. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Both either have or would suggest to new writers hone the skill of understanding that your story structure is solid and working.
I would send you to something called the Eckerd College Writers Conference. I was there as a student. I'm there now on faculty. It's only 1 week or 8 days, and you've got writers like Dennis Lehane, Ann Hood, Andre Dubus III, Laura Lippman, Stuart Onan. So you don't have to make the great commitment to an MFA to have really, really good instruction. I would also recommend the book Story by Robert McKee, if you haven't looked at that yet. It's geared towards screenwriting, but story is story, and he has a really good, it's all about structure. So on a structural level, those would be my best.
I don't know.
Person who has not, who it just comes naturally to, right?
I wonder from both of you, how many rejections did you get when you first started writing before you were accepted as a writer?
No, Michael was definitely rejected before. I sold my first book when I think I was 19. But I'd had 3 rejected. So everyone's like, oh, you published so young. It had to have been your first novel. No. Tonight I Said Goodbye was the sequel to a book that got pretty close. An editor at St. Martin's wanted it, and then they couldn't, so they've got to sell the whole team on it. And I just stuck with the sequel because I thought I was getting better. And the sequel sold. So I have a few.
Well, first of all, you have to remember my first book was written on an Olivetti typewriter. I was very lucky. There was no, yeah, I hadn't had it wasn't, my first book was not rejected.
Wow.
That's what
That is truly rare.
Yeah, well, I mean, I shouldn't, there was actually an auction, and I think I knew nothing with the agent I had at that time, and he said, go with the highest number.
The money.
and it was a mistake right from the get-go.
Yeah.
Right?
That's really true
Yeah.
because at publishers, sometimes the highest bid, they don't live up to it. Very true. Well, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention. Let's give our authors a round of applause.
Anyone who braves 110-degree heat to come listen to us.
Right. So
Thank
if you
you.
need caloric refreshment before you go, there are cookies and 2 kinds of pie and drinks over here. And if you'd like to get your books signed, I think we've eliminated all the probably be better if you just stay here.
Okay.
All right. Will that work out? So we didn't give out numbers for some reasons. So why don't you just sort of, without bashing into each other, wander up here to the front and go off and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks a lot.